I hope you're enjoying your 2 days filled with knowledge, exchange, and interactions and networking. For me, this is my third Bled Strategic. I'm attending it for the third time. And I think it's a unique platform because you can ask the most uncomfortable questions here and still discuss them with people of diverse backgrounds and ages, and still you sort of, have exchange of knowledge. Just before I introduce my panel, I would like to request you that you can actually use hashtag BSF to tweet about this panel, quotes, or maybe your own impression of the panel. I don't know whether it's the right time to say that maybe you guys have downloaded the application. Please do that, because it's a call for paper-free, environment-friendly conference. And also, it will help you sort of not only follow the program, but I think it is also helpful for you to know who are the participants. Super. So who are the participants, and then you can always get back to them later on the details that they have shared on the app. Today for this panel, we have with us esteemed guests who have worked in the field on the topic and have been in the policy making circles, as well as we have academics and others. So I would take this opportunity to first introduce our panelists. We have with us His Excellency Dr. Danilo Turk, who is the former president of the Republic of Slovenia. Dr. Turk is a diplomat and a politician, and he's also a professor of international law. He served at UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, and prior to that, the Slovenian ambassador to the UN. He was also a chairperson of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace, and chairs the board of directors of the Global Fairness Initiative. This is an NGO in Washington, D.C. So we would love to learn about your experience in water and peace in specific in this particular panel. Ms. Aira Kalila, she is a senior advisor to the former Finnish president Tarja Halonen since 2013. She has served as the director of the Ministry of Environment, and in 2015 she was the EU's lead negotiator on climate change. And I understand that Ms. Kalila, you have been engaged in this process since 1989, and she has attended a lot of summits. So it's of great value to have you here, because we'll be able to sort of put the entire debate in context. Then we have Dr. Adil Najam on my left. He's an academician. He's the inaugural dean of the Padi School of Global Affairs at Boston University, and he's also the former vice chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. He was a co-author of third and fourth assessment of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the work for which IPCCC was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He has written 12 books and also authored many papers, and recently he's also working on climate change and security paper. I have on my right side Anna Stanek. She is an expert on international and EU energy law. She regularly advises government, international institutions, and companies on issues such as maritime boundary dispute, concession agreements for the construction of large-scale energy infrastructure, right of self-determination, human rights, climate change. She is most recently, Stanek has been advising on the international relationship between EU and international law and the implications of Brexit. So we will have discussion on Brexit as well in the context of climate change and security. So some words about the panel. We all know that there is a growing consensus right now on the fact that climate change is happening. It is eroding social, economic, and political life of people, pushing them in insecurities, and these insecurities could lead to a lot of disturbances, not only at the national level, but also at the global level. Because there will be, it's also assessed that there will be mass migration. However, right now, the climate refugees or climate migrants are not recognized. So also we'll be asking our panelists about that. I think I'm going to start with Ms. Kalila, since you have been serving at the high level. just to define for our audiences here briefly, the nexus between climate change and security.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. As I see that the audience is mostly European here, I'm now referring to the extreme heat waves we had here in Europe. And for instance, in my country, it meant, together with the drought, it meant a loss of 70% of our crops. So our farmers will be suffering quite a lot. We know that the impacts of climate change will cause droughts in some regions, and then in other regions will lead to floods like it happened a week ago in Japan. And the impact of both of these extremes would be that we would have a shortage of both water, drinking water and food. And that would mean also loss of jobs in countrysides. People would, particularly men, would move to paid work to cities, and women and children would stay in the countryside. So you would have, let's say, the first security threat at the family level, when the families would be breaking in some cases. Then, if we are looking the bigger picture, these rising temperatures would also globally lead to increasing poverty, increasing inequality, and it would undermine our efforts to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we agreed in the autumn of 2015. The Global Economic Forum has made some research and prognosis what would happen if the climate would increase by 2 degrees, 3 degrees, until 6 degrees. I would not like to bother you with the details, but even on the 2 degrees increase, we would have a rise of the sea level by 1 meter in Asia, also in North Africa, in the Nile Delta. It would mean economic disasters and huge losses to infrastructures which are located on the coastal side. And then we would be forced to move the population. 1/3 of the rainforest would be lost, and a huge amount of biodiversity which is necessary for the eco-services. The European Commission, with the leadership of its High Representative Solana, former High Representative, has also then, based on these estimates, made analysis what would happen in various regions. And I can just give you few examples. I referred already to North Africa, so the situation would be so that huge amounts of the soil, some 20–30% would suffer from drought, and that would lead even diminishing agricultural productivity during the period when the population would still continue to grow. Then we know already what has been happening in Darfur. That is partly also due to the lack of food and lack of water. I was also referring to Nile Delta. So in Middle East, 2/3 of the Arab world is pending sources of water which come outside of the region. And Jordan and Yarmouk rivers are expected to see a reduction of the flow of water, and that would affect Israel, Palestinian territories and Jordan. And significant drop, of course, might happen also in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia. In South Asia, the sea level rise may threaten habitat of the people as much as 40%, around 2 billion people within the 60 kilometers of the coastline. And changes in monsoon rains and decreasing melt of Himalaya will affect more than 1 million people. Central Asia, we would see then the melting of glaciers in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and that would also affect harmfully the agriculture. Latin America and Caribbean would also suffer the decreasing productivity, particularly in the Andean region, and that would be then added by the impacts of El Nino. And Gulf of Mexico would then be affected by major hurricanes. I come to my own region, which is the Arctic region, and there we are already seeing the melting of the Arctic polar ice. That would open up new access to energy sources and then also new waterways, which will change the geopolitical situation there. So these are just examples what could happen, and these developments are very much on the way. Maybe I can stop here, but I wish that we would, against this background, actually then concentrate on discussing what we can do. And I would only like to refer to a very important speech what the Secretary General Guterres made last night in New York. And he is preparing a climate summit for the next year, which is preceding actually the period when the governments should set new commitments to achieve the Paris Agreement, where we have agreed that we should stay below, well below, under the 2 degrees, aiming to stay under the 1.5 degrees.
Thank you, Ms. Kalila. I think the human security aspect, Dr. Najam, Ms. Kalila has sort of touched upon. How do you think that what circumstances could actually lead to, because these are non-traditional security threats, and whatever is being said are speculations. I'm not sure if there are any facts to it, and if there are, do we have that kind of security threat manifesting itself in any country, in any region? And what circumstances could lead us, because there's also a thought in the literature where people say that we could have like big wars, climate wars.
So thank you. Thank you also for having me here at Bled. It's been a wonderful 2 days. A few thoughts. I actually would very politely suggest that we should stop talking about climate change in the future tense. we do ourselves a disservice and it's a lie. We should accept that we have failed. Climate change is here. We today, as of now, live in the age of adaptation. For billions of people in the world, including in my region, this is not something that will happen. It is something that is happening. What will happen will exacerbate because essentially you and I didn't do what we were supposed to do. The only reason, we were never supposed to talk about adaptation, right? We were supposed to be a half-serious species and we were supposed to solve this with mitigation, before it came to adaptation. So adaptation is essentially the failure of negotiation and the failure of mitigation. Having said that polite note, let me suggest the following on security. The question I think really before us is not as much what climate is, but what security is. Like many things, climate is also changing the notion of what security is, as is many other things. First of all, the link between climate and security is a very clear and old one. Napoleon knew all about it. I think that's all he was thinking about when he was walking back from Russia. Hannibal was thinking about climate and security when he was taking the elephants up. So essentially what climate change does is that if our understanding of how climate works changes, then our understanding of security has to evolve, has to adapt. I don't think there will be climate wars because much more serious things will happen well before that. But we can come to that later. But climate as a security issue at one level is that. Right? So if you are, some of my work is in this, if you are in military, you are thinking about where my bases are, the USS. A lot of its international bases happen to be near water. So just as a practical issue, if sea level rise is real, then you're going to start thinking about it. But that's one way of thinking about military readiness, about military movement, and so on and so forth. So well before you come to climate war, climate as a military planning issue, military readiness issue, has to be dealt with. So that is thing one. Thing two is, I was on the scientific panel of the ARENA's World Commission on the geopolitics of energy transition, and one of the interesting things happening is that some of the good things may have security implications. So if we move away from oil to renewables, there is a new security paradigm around renewables. First of all, it changes a security balance that might exist. Second, renewables with things like, materials like rare earths and so on and so forth may have their own concerns. And then a lot of renewable energy will require a type of regional cooperation that doesn't exist in many parts of the world, especially with smart grids and so on and so forth. So if you start thinking of your region, the Middle East, it would require a different type of geopolitics before you can have a different type of energy. We've seen that actually work very well in your region, but I'm from Pakistan. Try building a grid between India and Pakistan and get them to cooperate when we have so many problems cooperating about water. So there is a new whole security paradigm there. But to your question, I'm sorry to have taken off, I do think that the most important manifestations are in human security. And I think we should also stop taking seriously the lie that security is only about nations. Right? That might have been true 500 years ago when there was a sovereign and the security essentially meant his, and nearly always it was his security. And let me give you just an example. A lot of my work is on human security, where climate meets security in very, very real ways. Right? So both our moderator and myself are from Pakistan. This is what I mean that let's stop talking about in the future tense. My country, Pakistan, 207 million people. We are in the 8th consecutive year of a flood. At the same time, a 6th consecutive year of a drought. You can beat both at the same time if you're a big country. And the 4th consecutive year of a heat wave. Right? In fact, neighboring India, further down Bangladesh, if you look at some of these weather patterns, if you will. Now again, I'm being very careful, I come from the sciences. It is not clear how much of this is new because of climate change and how much of it is existing pattern. But when you start seeing patterns exacerbating, you say, well, that's exactly what the climate wallahs were telling us. That it won't cause new problems, it would take all old problems and make them more persistent. Last point on this, and I want to hear from my colleagues here, but the last point on this, I think the front line of climate insecurity is going to be two things in particular in the short term. By the short term, I mean next 20 years. One of them is migration. But well before migration and even triggering migration, I think the single front line of climate insecurity is going to be water. When we were in the age of mitigation, we were really about carbon management. When you thought you could actually do something, essentially it was about energy because it was about carbon. So the thing was, I will manage my energy, energy will manage carbon, carbon will manage climate. Now that it is too late, we still have to do that. But a lot of it has moved from sea to elsewhere on the periodic table. And it's mostly moved to water. What do I mean? What I mean is this. Think about the impacts of climate change. And I bet you that most of them are about water. When climate change hits, what happens? Sea level, water rises. Sea level rise. Water disappears. Drought. Water melts. Glaciers. Water falls from the sky like no one's business. Extreme events. So we are going to write the future history of climate, and especially the history of climate insecurity, in water more than in anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Najam, and I think that already brings me to our next speaker, because he had been the chair on high-level panel on water and peace. Sir, I would actually request you to sort of share with us, because as Dr. Najam also said, that water is something which is going to be impacted the most, and that's actually the basis for the life. So if that is triggered, how do you see also the nexus of energy and water in that? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, clearly water is becoming more and more a priority, but of course water is not a new issue in security equations. And I would like to start by telling you an example of something that happened some 13 years ago. I worked for the United Nations at the time, and one of the themes which was very high on the agenda of the UN Security Council was Sudan. And Sudan at that time meant two things. It meant South Sudan and it meant Darfur. And at that time, John Danforth of the United States was leading this whole process. And there was a belief, as a result of diplomatic activities of that period, that we have to get the agreement on South Sudan, and as a result, we shall see a new political dynamic that will allow the international community to address the issue of Darfur more effectively. Now that was the political analysis of the time, which was very widely shared. It was shared by people who are handling the Security Council, the regional specialists, everybody. It was very strongly felt that this is the way to go. Of course, what was lacking were several key ingredients, and one of them was the whole question of the ecosystem in which this whole armed conflict was evolving, the conflict between pastoralists and agriculturalists, and how the dynamic of the conflict has reached a point at which you cannot no longer rely on purely political elements in an effort to address effectively that conflict and try to stop it. Now, obviously later things like this happened in Mali as well, where the ecosystem element was there, was not properly understood. It has been happening in other places. And as a result, the Security Council has started very slowly and with a very serious delay to address some of these questions more directly. I was in the Security Council in 2016 as chairman of the Global High-Level Panel, and I started this kind of more general discussion. This year in March, Netherlands opened a discussion on the Lake Chad, again, to make sure that people dealing with issues of war and peace understand the climatic, the ecosystem aspects, water aspects better. That does not mean that conflicts do start because of water, or that water is the main instrument or the main objective, but it is always there, and it has to be understood. Water phenomena have to be understood. This is also one of the conclusions of the panel that dealt with water, the UN World Bank panel that dealt with water most generally. So I think that examples like this demonstrate the growing importance of water in armed conflicts, and of course one can go further. One can see the growing practices of using water as a weapon of war or having water as an object of attack. We have seen this in Syria, we have seen this in Yemen. I understand that this was also discussed earlier today. And this is a very disturbing development which has to be stopped. Of course, it is a huge violation of humanitarian law. Red Cross, for example, International Committee of the Red Cross has published very serious analysis of urban warfare nowadays and the effects of that warfare on water infrastructure and as a result on everything that affects civilians. This goes beyond starving civilian population. This goes into the destruction of hospitals, destruction of schools, hugely strong reverberations. So what we have here is really a very frightening situation. And of course, it all has to do with the developments that the two preceding speakers dealt with. And of course, our panel had to address this phenomena and make recommendations to the Security Council and to others with regard to the question of how to deal with water issues in the prevention of armed conflicts, in management of armed conflicts, in post-conflict peace building, in all these different situations. Because in each of them, there is a strong case for addressing water issues directly and very seriously. Now coming to the second part of my remarks and also trying to answer your question, I would say, obviously, water shouldn't be seen only as a problem or as a matter of conflicts. Water also has to be seen as an instrument of peace. And of course, there is a long and very strong history which shows that water cooperation can be a major factor of peace. In Europe, we have many examples like this. Here in Slovenia, we are proud of the fact that Sava River Agreement, which was the first river agreement after the Balkan Wars, demonstrated the ability of multilateral cooperation in the region and had a stabilizing effect. And so are many other examples. The most sophisticated example of transboundary water cooperation today happens to be in Africa, in West Africa and Senegal. Senegal River, which includes Guinea, Senegal, Mali and Mauritania. It's a border river which is a matter of very intense cooperation between neighboring countries for about 40 years now, has given rise to an institution, the OMVS, Organisation de Mise en Œuvre du Fleuve du Sénégal, which actually owns all the installations on the river. And they include also a dam at the area where Senegal River is emptying into the sea, which is preventing salt water of entering into the river. So it's not only for electricity production and irrigation, but also for prevention of salt water entering into land. And that's going to be more and more important. That's part of the adaptation. So that cooperation exists, and much more of that type of cooperation has to happen. And on water energy nexus, obviously, in a very broad sense, moving from carbon-based energy more and more towards renewable energy will make big changes. And of course, we see these changes happening. If one reads the reports of the International Energy Agency, one would see that in, let's say, 2-3 years ago, people talked about the volatility of prices, question of investment in oil sector, the stabilization of gas markets and things like this. But now they are talking more and more about electricity, about renewables, and about the changing equations in a very general sense. The specific issue that I would like to address or to especially mention is the question of desalination, which is going to be more and more important, which is energy intensive, and energy generation which is water intensive. So we have needs in both areas. Now, how that would work with adaptation is really not very clear at this point. Technologies are developing, but again, we need new patterns of international cooperation, especially in the areas where obviously this is most needed. I'm very glad to see Minister and Secretary General Amr Moussa with us. He certainly has views on how these things impact the region of the Middle East, the entire region. I mean, from Atlantic to Afghanistan, the whole area, and what needs to be done to improve the cooperation in that big area.
Can I just add one sentence just to second what the presenter just said on water as an instrument of cooperation. So if you put all the international treaties together and organize them by subject, the single most common subject of international cooperation is water. Second largest is trade. Not all of them work, but more importantly, even in most difficult areas, India and Pakistan, 70 years, the only treaty that has stood the test of time. It's not a perfect treaty, there's many problems, but the only treaty is endless water. In Israel and Palestine, the only treaty that has constantly stood the test of time, the groundwater agreement. So water has also this quality that because it is so central, while conflicts exist, there is an inherent logic to cooperation even in difficult times.
When I come back to you, I would like to ask, will this be the same when we had more impacts of climate change in the future? Or will we have it the other way around? And also, Mr. President, from you. So, Ms. Anna, I would actually like to you to sort of respond to the migration part of it. Does the international law accommodate or is flexible enough to sort of accommodate the new needs which are coming now due to climate change? For example, international migration. There was this report by UK government which was commissioned in 2011, Foresight report, and at that time, they were actually trying to see whether there'll be mass migration towards Europe or not because of climate change. And then the report actually said that no, they will be either trapped because of the disasters back home, or people will not have enough money to at least come all the way from one continent to the other. But this was proven wrong when we had Syrian conflict. We had mass migration. So if we look the same way on the climate-driven migration, maybe these people might not be trapped, and they might also cross borders in the way they have done during Syrian conflict. So my question to you is how the climate migrants are sort of, will be accommodated or can be?
I seem to have gotten the easiest question. I think that I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean, is there law to protect them? I think the answer is no, in the sense that the Refugee Convention, when it was written back in 1951, was not anticipating anything other than political refugees, and it's written specifically in that respect. And even with that convention, we have seen countries effectively undermining that convention itself in terms of political refugees. The ability or the willingness to extend the Refugee Convention to include climate change migrants or people fleeing for any other reason other than political, I think is none, I'm sorry to say. So we are looking at international law and national law dealing with these matters as a security matter, not as a human rights matter. And I think there is a stark difference, therefore, in the approach that, for example, the Strasbourg Court takes with respect to how we see even climate change and pollution as affecting our right to family life and a breach of Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And we have now very successful claims being brought within the human rights system and outside of that, and I'd be happy to talk about more of those things. But we are not seeing that translating into a more global right to others to enjoy that same benefit or that same right that we, the more fortunate ones, have. So I see, other than a discussion that Europe is now mounting on dealing with migration in the sense of making people not come, as opposed to dealing with the people that have arrived, I agree with you that we are in a denial situation. I think it's very sad to see that organizations like, I think they're called Open, what are they called? Open Heart or Open Society or something. There is a boat, one of the very few ships that has remained on the Mediterranean that saves lives of migrants that are coming across. And there have been successful efforts now from a number of countries, leading Italy being the main one, that have actually stopped them from being able to save people by accusing them of human trafficking. So there is this very sad manipulation of the stories to actually prevent people from helping. My conviction is that ordinary people in Europe are willing to help and see the universality of this issue. And I see that migration, and maybe that's where you want to talk about Brexit, but I'm not sure. I'll leave you to ask me that question. Use this fear and the fear of the other, or the fear of the unknown, for other reasons. But just to maybe anticipate your question with respect to Brexit, I did not see, and I was in Britain at the time, and I am British as well as Slovenian and Australian, but I did not see Brexit as a migration or an immigration issue at all at its root. Ultimately, for me, it's the lack of conviction of the politicians to lead this issue that will cause the problems. I think it is inevitable that people will come, and we need to deal with what will happen when they come, and we need to ensure that they will have equal rights when they do come. At least that's my view. The willingness will need to be there. I think what are they planning to do? Put them in camps or what? I don't exactly know how they envisage this. Now we have obviously this deal with Turkey and with other countries, and that's sort of like pretending there is no issue. And we don't see the suffering visibly. But I think the moral obligation, at least from the ones of us that are more fortunate, is needed.
Could I just comment two issues which have been now raised in the discussion? So first on the issue of war and security. Adil, you said that you don't believe that climate change would cause the war. I would just comment that there is never only one single cause to war, but many causes and combination of causes. And I would definitely say that we have already seen wars over the competition of resources, and now water became on the top of the discussion here. So if we don't have sufficient water, we don't have even food, so that it is the nexus of life. And so water security is not only an absence of war. Security is much wider concept, and we could put it, for instance, that it is a situation where a human being can realize her or his dreams and live a decent life. I think that, for instance, the girls who are now forced to walk longer distances to get water and due to that reason don't go to school, they have lost their dreams for a proper life, and they are not living in a secure situation. And then on the migration, so it definitely is a very serious security issue, both in the countries of departure, transit countries, and then the countries of destination, because we have not probably understood that those are not the poorest ones who leave their countries. Those countries who are losing their population for migration may lose the best of their resources, because real poor and big people, they don't even have the resources to go and live. And then we have seen what happens, for instance, in Europe, in the countries of transition. So they have caused already imbalance, insecurity, conflicts. And then same in the countries of destination. We are facing now in European Union the situation where the migration has caused a lot of let's say, problems in decision making. I would say that the European Union is somehow even stagnated in making progress on some areas where it has not been able to solve properly the issue of migration. And that has already been felling governments in Europe. We know the results of the Swedish elections, where the main issue was migration. We know also that Angela Merkel had considerable problems with her government to try to solve the migration issue. So it is causing instability and insecurity.
So what I hear from the panelists is that maybe we have human insecurities, but we might not have these issues leading to wars. And I also sort of hear from this side that, no, that's not, so we should be happy if there are wars. No, I'm just, so, and also that we are not really prepared in terms of law or in terms of internationally sort of on the human rights perspective, because all those who will be sort of forced to leave their countries or areas due to climate change might not get the same human rights internationally or where they move. So my question would be from all panelists, if you could one by one answer, is that we need, what I see, that we need more cooperation in this issue, but we are not having that kind of laws in place, or maybe right now the Brexit question is basically here, that we see more and more nationalism being promoted. We see that we have countries where nationalism is being promoted, as well as we see that Brexit is happening and things like this. So in a world where cooperation is no more something which is being promoted, how do we see security issues unfolding when it comes to climate change? Dr. Raja, maybe you want to.
I think I'll cede my floor to someone who knows more.
Look, we should not believe that legal instruments do not exist. Of course, there are certain deficits here, especially when it comes to migration issues. Of course, that would have to be put on the agenda more openly, more directly. But of course, in order to do that, you would need to have a basic policy approach developed. We don't have policy, and when we don't have policy, then of course it's difficult to either apply the existing law or to build a new law. But then again, when we talk about climate change and water as a priority, because most of the climate change phenomena are expressed through water. So water is a priority whichever way we approach the question of climate change. There, of course, there are formulae about water cooperation which are well established. I mean, we spoke about the treaties that exist. And of course, these methods of work have not been fully used. For example, there are around 380 shared river resources, rivers and lake resources in the world, but involving around 145 states. But there are only 87 transboundary water arrangements. So there is still much to do with the using of the existing or similar instruments. I'd like to mention the UNECE Convention, that's the UN Economic Commission for Europe, which has developed the Helsinki Convention years ago, now open to the whole world, which is a very useful legal instrument, which includes a lot of advisory and consultative possibilities. So, instruments are either there or are developing, and of course, what is needed is political will. Now, political will is not something that just happens. Political will has to be generated. And in order to generate political will, one has to have a high level of confidence, and then, of course, commitment. And I hope from this realization that nowadays we are moving from mitigation to adaptation, that would help building the necessary commitment. I'm sometimes surprised by what I see in legal expressions. I was in India in February, and it's coincided, my visit coincided with the ruling of the Supreme Court of India, which quoted the general public international law principles on water cooperation, which say, essentially, on the one hand, fair and equitable use of water resources, and on the other hand, do no major harm, do no significant harm. Now, this is from the Water Convention of the UN, Non-Navigational Uses of International Waterways of 1997. But now the Supreme Court of India invoked that principle for a domestic purpose. They said, well, look, I mean, water is a shared resource, and no individual state in the Federation of India can claim to have the totality of water resources that exist on its territory. They have to think about the others. No, I'm not trying to make a big, how should I say, conclusion on that basis, but what I'm trying to say is there are legal principles, there are legal instruments that can help. They should be used much more widely, and there should be an effort to build political will for such use. Of course, there are areas where we need new legislation, but that, of course, is a separate subject.
If I can lead exactly from where President Turk left. So, but before that, one thing on the war issue. I'm not being an optimist when I say that there isn't going to be war. I'm going to say that when people think that there's going to be a water war or climate war, the sense seems to be that if there isn't, then all is okay. What I'm saying is there's a lot of insecurity without war. And you don't have to wait for war to do something. That's my concern with that argument. The second thing, and building right on President Turk, I think it is a folly to think of existing instruments only. First of all, they have a lot of breadth that can be used. But it is a folly to think that they can be applied directly to this. Let me take your migration question. Right? So we have an image of what migration looks like, and we have an image, particularly these days, of what a refugee looks like. Climate is not going to be like that. Climate doesn't happen it's not like a war or an earthquake that happens at 3:42, and suddenly you have lots of refugees. It's something that kind of creeps up on you. It's more like economic migration. So let me give you a case. I don't know if there's a friend from Bangladesh here, but I think the front line of migration, if you want to understand, is something called the Sundarbans, the beautiful forest in Bangladesh. These are mangroves. Now, this is what sea level rise really looks like. There is a micro change in the mix of salt and fresh water. You can't even see it, you can't measure it in any way you and I will understand. But the mix between sea and fresh water in the Sundarbans has changed. You can't see it, the shrimp can. And what is happening is that shrimp has gone down, and the livelihoods of literally, in this case, millions of people who depend on the shrimp has disappeared. So now you have literally millions of people whose livelihood has been taken. What do you think they do? They move from the village in the Sundarbans, first to Dhaka, then maybe to Calcutta. I don't know if they come to Bled, but they probably come to Boston. Right? And so what I'm saying is that livelihood forces, now they don't come in a ship. They come one at a time, and what you have is that the strongest, youngest, most entrepreneurial move out. And much like what happened in the so-called Green Revolution, you are left with a hollowing out of communities. We've seen this in Africa, and this is the type of pattern. Now, that's not going to be dealt with refugee law as it now is, but it is going to put pressure. Right? We've seen these livelihood movements in many, many types of places. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you take the age of adaptation seriously, then our understanding of what cooperation is has to also become different. And the biggest thing is the one that you said. In some ways, at the one moment in human history, when we had the capability, the knowledge, and the need to think global, we have demonstrated that we do not have the wisdom to act global. And that, I think, is the tragedy of the times that we are living in.
Just maybe a point, since we have quite a lot of difficulties in trying to deliver these changes at a global level, I mean, one of the encouraging things that is happening is that actually the existing legal tools that we have, whether it's in human rights law, whether it's in tort law, and in some cases even securities law, is being used to, if nothing else, to force governments to act. So we have cases, and the most recent case is one that was just brought by claimants from 8 different countries against the European Commission and the European Parliament on the 24th of May of this year, to say that the undertakings and the commitments with respect to renewables and climate change are simply not ambitious enough. and that the failure to be ambitious enough is actually a breach of European law. And the amazing thing is that the General Council has accepted that it has jurisdiction to hear the case. So this is a very important case, and it's one case that follows from a successful case in Holland in 2015, in which about 900 Dutch people brought a claim against the Dutch government and actually won in the first instance court, where the claim was that the Dutch commitments to reduction of greenhouse or carbon emissions was not ambitious enough. And the court actually prescribed what the level of carbon reduction needed to be in order to meet the requirements of the law. Now that's an appeal, and we'll see what happens next. But there's been now a barrage of cases across the world following these, including in Kenya, including in other developing countries. So they are using existing tools to bring claims against states. And as I said before, there are claims in the European Court of Human Rights. There are claims not only against states, but there are also claims against corporations. And I think the most interesting claim and the most fascinating claim is the one that is being pursued against ExxonMobil in the United States by New York and a number of other cities and and counties in California that are basically bringing claims for fraud and breaches of securities law, as in they have misled the shareholders and misled and therefore breached fundamental rules of securities law of the United States. It's a very inventive way of using existing law to basically say ExxonMobil knew about climate change before it actually advised shareholders that it knew about it, and therefore misled its shareholders as to the value of its own company. And these are amazing claims. They are obviously being resisted heavily by the companies involved, and of course Trump and his administration is involved, unfortunately, on the negative side of things. But what I'm trying to say is that we have tools that we can use, and this might be one of the very rare instances where lawyers and the law can do something to actually force political change. Because if the politicians are not willing to adopt ambitious measures, then maybe the law will force them to do so. And so we are very much now in the hands of where the judges are going to actually use the tools that exist and obviously interpret them slightly differently to where they were before, because obviously before they were not prepared to do these things. But I think there is a much more a willingness to use existing laws in a more robust way. So I am quite, I mean, this is not dealing with adaptation. This is not dealing with anything other than how do we get laws in place that we might need to deliver things in the future. But I think it is a very important role that law can play. And that can be done without a global agreement. That's something that ordinary people can do, and companies will end up having to do at the local and regional level. And I think that's where the force might be. That's where it might happen. So there's a lot of people who talk about courts being the next phase of climate change, that's where the actions are going to be. That without that pressure, we won't see any change at the political level.
So I think now we should be talking about the missing link. Where do we need to sort of, in order to evade the security risk, what are the gaps? Where do we need to fill in these gaps in order to sort of, as we said, that water is not going to lead to wars, but would be more like a peace instrument. We already have some instruments which can work, and some of them maybe need to be adapted. We need to create political will at maybe regional level as well as international level, global level. So what are the missing links where we can sort of find, you know, how to evade the security threat which will be in future?
I think if we now consider the climate change, so I think the missing link is between the objective, what the heads of states agreed in Paris 2015, and then the action. So what was agreed was that the rise of temperature should be kept below 2 degrees. Aiming to stay under 1.5 degrees. And now the fact and situation is that those commitments which the government delivered at Paris does not cover yet that objective. So we are less than halfway to what we are aiming to. So these measures would reach to some 30% of our targeted goal. And luckily, the agreement has also a review mechanism. It says that by the year 2020, governments have to review their commitments, which is very soon. And so actually next year we should start already looking the situation and start making new commitments. There has been also a lot of analysis done what would be their share of the European Union, for instance, and its member states, and what would be technically and economically feasible. And it shows that our fair share should be more than 60%, but that is not yet 60% reduction by the year 2030. But that might not yet be quite feasible. But what has happened now very recently is that both the solar and wind energy have become competitive, so that they are now actually the cheapest sources of energy compared with coal and oil, so that there are no economic obstacles anymore to go over to the renewable energies. And so at least we should aim within the European Union a very, let's say, realistic but at the same time ambitious review process until the year 2020, which is very soon. And actually, I'm proud to say that Finland will be chairing the European Union at the end of 2019, so that we at least are having combating climate change as one of our priorities, and will be working to a ambitious review.
Sure. I do want to build on this. I want to have the confidence you seem to have in the multilateral process. I don't any longer. Let me make a prediction. 2 degrees will not be met. 1.5 degrees, which many countries based is necessary for many small island states, will not be met. And let me also remind us as we celebrate Paris and ourselves that the original agreement, the number was 0. You were there, I was there, I was at Rio. The original agreement was that there will be no change in stratospheric. So this has crept, and you and I, this is, in some ways, let me say this, it is unfair to blame governments and heads of states. They didn't let us down. You and I did. We as citizens, particularly, whether in rich countries or poor countries, rich citizens chose not to change our lifestyle. We convinced ourselves technology will come and these new things will come, and at some point things will change, and mostly because we weren't feeling the effects. And my nightmare scenario is that we have actually figured out that most of the impacts are going to be elsewhere. So this is not in my backyard, and it is fine. So let me tell you what will happen when 2 degrees won't be met. For example, there's a country called Vanuatu. It's a very small country. And part of the point I'm making is I don't think it's a failure of law that led us here. It's a failure of compassion. I know compassion is very difficult to create, but that's what you and I did. Right? I use an electric vehicle, and by that way I buy my sins. It's like buying indulgences. Now I don't have to do anything else. Let me tell you about Vanuatu. Vanuatu is one of the countries that at 2 degrees change, which is now nearly inevitable, may lose all or some of its territory. Now, if your country or my country, some other country came and took half my territory, would that be a security issue? It would. Right? But when climate is going to take it, and the thumbprint on that is yours and mine, because that molecule came from me. Now, compassion here, one of my favorite agreements, is that New Zealand has said that they will take on the entire population of Vanuatu in case that happens. Thank you, New Zealand. But Vanuatu is very small. Now, please raise your hand if you are ready to take 50 million Bangladeshis who are also under threat of going under at 5. Right? So what I'm saying is there is an urgency here. And while we want to celebrate all of these things, I think we have partly lost the urgency because we've actually become very good at our own rhetoric. In some ways, when you and I were at, and maybe others too, at 92 Rio Earth Summit, I would not have imagined that in 2018, we would still be talking about this. So while there is much that has been achieved, I think that sense of urgency, the loss of that sense of urgency is probably the most important thing that needs to get back. And as I said, it is unfortunate in 2018 because the globalness that we actually believed in 92, we have become too old and jaded to believe it in any longer.
Well, I basically agree with the analysis. The question for our panel was how to recommend specific measures that might help. Against the background of this large picture. Let me give you a few examples where we saw the future relating to water and international water cooperation lies. I mean, one was water diplomacy. Water diplomacy is a known phenomenon. It exists. It has to be strengthened. It has to be developed further. I don't have the time to go into all the details. But one piece of information would suffice. The United Nations system consists of 32 units dealing with water, 32 different programs, funded agencies. They are coordinated by something that is called UN Water, but it is very loose. It is not something that produces real effect. So we have to change these things. And it's practical. It can be defined what the needed changes are. Second, finance. Usually when people talk about climate change and financial needs to reverse whatever needs to be reversed, they talk about huge amounts of money. But then again, there are certain things that can be done which do not require huge amounts of money, but are really necessary. For example, if you want to help building water infrastructure in the transboundary context, it's very important to take care of two things. First, to create what financial people call safe space, a sufficiently early consultation that would define the risks and ways of avoiding or removing those risks. This is not being done. This is part of water diplomacy and should be done. The second thing is covering ancillary costs, such as insurance, such as interest, and such things. I mean, in addition to the basic, the fundamental investment that, of course, mobilizes large amounts of money, there is a need to take care of these smaller things in order to facilitate, together with this prior existence of safe space, environment where investment can take place. And then there is one big area where much more cooperation is needed, and these are aquifers, that is underground water, underground reservoirs. There are about 400 of them in the world, and there are only 7 agreements in existence that deal with these issues. Now, some of these agreements are old, like the one between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. There is one which is very recent and very interesting, the Guarani Aquifer agreement between Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, which has divided the wealth of water among the countries according to various calculations that they were able to agree on. So, there is a possibility to do new things. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a formula that would solve the problem of adaptation, but these are all needed, necessary tasks. They are not being taken seriously enough, and one of the objectives today is to figure out what needs to be done in a very practical sense. I'm not going to talk about what needs to be done in terms of strengthening international humanitarian law. I mean, there are also tasks there. But if we talk about climate change and dealing with these issues which have a long-term effect and do not show the drama immediately, we shall necessarily come to this sort of instruments that have to be either created or, if they exist, better used.
Just what is missing. I remember after the Paris Agreement was signed, and Sir David King, who was the UK Special Advisor on Climate Change and the main negotiator, was speaking in London at a conference. And after the conference, I didn't want to ask a question in the conference because I didn't want to ask a provocative question, but I accosted him in the elevator and I said, well, where are the oceans? You know, how do you deal with climate change and you don't mention oceans and you don't deal with oceans? So that's one big thing that other than in the preamble, which is nothing, isn't dealt with. And it's not just important for carbon, but it's also important generally in terms of climate change. So one thing that I don't see anything really happening on is oceans. The other thing, at the Paris Agreement, the decision or the commitment was made by 23 states to put aside 100 billion, supposedly, in something called Mission Innovation. They have had now 3 meetings on Mission Innovation, and Sweden was the chair of Mission Innovation this year. But the one main thing that is missing is that they have no idea where to spend the money. So they have the money, but they can't find the projects. And one of the main problems there is that you have to actually change your whole way in which you consider projects. You know, we have this thing in finance, in how banks or even big IMF and other institutions finance projects. They have to be bankable. But what is the idea of bankable when you apply it to a climate change project or a green project is completely different. So you actually have to develop different tools. Your whole analysis has to change. You have to internalize external factors, which is not what bankers do. We as lawyers, I started my career as a syndicated loans and bonds lawyer. There's no concepts of these things. You know, the actual structure is not there. So you have to come up with a whole new way of looking at things in order to facilitate. So we are still we are somehow hampered by the existing structures that we have. And that translates also into complete silo thinking. So a person who is a climate change person rarely talks to an energy person, rarely talks to a renewables person, rarely talks to an environmental person. It was impossible for me to say that I was an energy lawyer without them assuming that I hated trees and I didn't know anything about human rights. You know, that is a problem that we face, and that is preventing any kind of cooperation. So I don't know how we overcome it, but I do see that is another major stumbling block, because we're not using all the resources, all the knowledge to actually bring things forward.
Thank you. Now I will just move to this part of the hall and would encourage you, if you have any comments or questions from the panelists, to sort of raise your hand and briefly introduce yourself. Yeah, I see this hand at the back.
Hello, my name is Jana. I work for Caritas Slovenia. I would like maybe to add what we didn't emphasize today. Water security is a very important issue connected with climate change, but we also forget on the food security. Myself, I'm going to the field visits in Rwanda and Burundi because we support their development cooperation projects, and I can see that people really can opportunity to produce enough food. I was victim in year 2017, internally displaced people in Burundi. It was terrible drought in the place called Kirundo, and they moved in another place, Ruzo, where I met with them, and they were really starving. So, and I met them again this year. We helped them, more than 200 families with humanitarian aid and so on. And this year I was very happy because I saw them much better, to see, well, they were not anymore malnourished, but I asked them, what will you do for your future? Will you come back to Kirundo, or you will stay here? And they say, no, there is all the time drought. So we will stay here. Sunday also went to nearby Tanzania to see the work. And what happened is also what you mentioned. This is also a pressure on the local population in Ruzo. So because they also use their natural resources, jobs and so on. It's not a war, but it's meant some local small conflicts. But I was victim also of many, many other things like this in the field, and my heart is in pain. So I want to say also that what is needed is not just here mitigation and so on, also we have to increase the official development aid, especially in Africa, because it's the most affected country by climate change, but they contribute the less. There you can see in the countryside, people are walking by foot every day, no cars, no electricity, and so on. So, but they are also feel the biggest effect. So we have to support them also with the food security, because we have to help them to invent new agricultural practices which will be adopted to climate change. As well, new technologies, knowledge and funds. They need also funds. They need our solidarity. I think that also solidarity is missing in our board. So just as a human being. So I think this is also important way. So we also are supported some of our projects by Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Republic of Slovenia. For example, now we have a very interesting project to improve the livelihoods of people in rural Rwanda. So we buy them for now, for example, for 60 families, goats, for manure production, and so on. So these are little steps, but it helps those families to develop in the place where they were born. In the base, everyone wants to develop in its own place. They don't want to move, and like you say, the poorest will not move. They don't have resources to move to a better life. So let's help also people to develop, and also I think the food is very important things besides water security. Also in this issue, in this area, also this should be talked about. Thank you very much.
We just take 2, 3, and then come back to the
Hello, Goran Gumza, anthropologist. I think we are dealing with the same issue all the time in this forum. My question would be, because the lady just said, let's help. I think we should stop helping. For example, what is the EU project? That would be my question. What is the United States project, China, which is in development, to start investing, that the people will stay where they are and find their resources at the domestic place. Of course, climate will move people, and we will have to be ready. And not will move, is moving. I agree completely. We are in the climate change. So the first question, how much money will be invested or is invested to make life better in Africa, in that case, and in Asia and everywhere elsewhere? Second of all, the question is, what will Western world, which is at the moment in this bubble that nothing is happening, do or is doing in these regards? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra and I'm a representative from the Greenville organization. And we provide people with green policy. So our gain is to make people think about what they do. As you tell, it's very important and it's very easy for each person, for each organization, just to change a little bit his or her life to help. But the problem is, when you come to a person and say, you want to be eco-friendly, people say, yes, it's very important, you do good things, oh, it's so easy. But when you come with a green policy and say, okay, this is steps, people say, no, 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 it's not my time. So what to do with this?
Very good question. It's actually whether it will be states at the end, or the cities, or individuals. So what's the cost down for that? Any other? Otherwise, yeah. 4, and then I'll come back and say.
Thank you very much. My name is Olaf Berstad. I'm the ambassador of Norway to Slovenia. I live in Budapest. And I agree with many things, including climate change, that it's ongoing. I'm also an archaeologist, 7,000 years ago in Scandinavia, we had every year weather like this, and all the glaciers were gone. The problem now is that we are 7 billion or more people on the earth, and resource scarcity and everything. And I totally agree with Mrs. Kallela talking about the stresses on the political systems in Europe of migration. But migration is only one effect of climate change. I think all our Nordic governments, Slovenia and others, we have a strong and comprehensive policy of dealing with this. But it's not working, and nobody has the proper key. Nobody understands the key, where it is. It's a complex issue. We have a total focus now on the ocean. We already have had climate change, migration, electrification of the society, etc. And Norway is one of the countries where actually we have electric cars not running on fossil produced electricity, but renewable energy. We have a strong policy now on supporting countries in the developing world, as we may call it, on taxation issues. The one lesson from the Norwegian change of attitude or change of life is to use taxation. We have high carbon taxes, which have definitely, and they are enforced. Carbon taxes, which have changed the attitude of the companies, and also given revenues to the state, of course. The success of the Norwegian electric mobility policy is to reduce taxes on fossil cars. So, with some countries in Africa, we already have a program here now on aid to taxation, and we see that for every dollar we put into the programs, the revenues for the state is 100-fold. The problem is, of course, corruption, how this money is being spent. I think there's a strong belief, at least in Norway, I think in many countries in Europe, that most countries will be able to finance their own development needs, including dealing with climate change, on their own resources, if they are properly mobilized and spent in an uncorrupt way.
Well, let me first introduce myself. I'm Bangladesh Ambassador to Austria, Hungary, and Slovenia, based in Vienna. Well, this is an interesting panel, and it has a strong relevance to my country, and Dr. Nazim referred to it several times. So I take the floor just to share some thoughts. There's nothing, a question, a query. I totally agree with all of you, what you have said about the climate science. Bangladesh is a living testimony to the climate change impact. As Ms. Kallela said, that the temperature is risen by 2 degrees centigrade. 1/3 of our territory will go underwater, displacing over 30 million people. And we are fully aware of the consequences. And we are under no illusion that the whole world will come and help us in this regard. We have initiated our own sort of policies and strategies to deal with this climate change impact. Although we always appreciate, and we are working with the international community, how we can survive this kind of climate change impact in the country. Perhaps all of you are aware, Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. We are 160 million people living in a territory of 55,000 square kilometers. More than 1,000 people live per square kilometer of land. So you understand the severity of the problem that we are facing from the climate change issue. Now, our government is working relentlessly on this issue. We have set aside national fund in our national budget of 200 million annually to deal with this climate change impact. Meaning, what are the impacts that we are facing? You see that we have around 700 kilometers of coastline. It's a huge coastline, and most of the people living in the coastal areas, and their livelihood would be impacted due to sea level rise. How it is going to impact? It has impact on many fronts, like on the livelihood, because there are fishermen living in the coastline. There are also agricultural crop farmers. They are basically growing crops on the coastline. When there is sea water intrusion in over land, that increases the salinity of the soil, rendering the soil unfit to grow crop. So we are having crop loss because of high salinity. On the other hand, you are looking at your world, so I must have stopped here. And on the other hand, he mentioned about the fisheries, the shrimp farming that is taking place in the coastal areas. That has, because of water intensity, saline water intensity, the greatest mangrove forest that we share with India has suffering several kind of problems. Number one, the trees, the Sundar trees, we call it Sundari trees, is having a different kind of disease called top dying disease. Because these trees have a breathing root. With the rise of water, the root grows up. So it breathes. And when there is a long standing water, because of sea rises, it remains submerged, causing the tree die from the top towards the root. And that root basically depopulate the whole mangrove forest in few decades. So these are serious tests. On the other hand, the fishermen who used to cultivate shrimp in that area, they have gone to the mainland. Now they are cultivating shrimp in the mainland. So these are, and you see in 1998, we had 45 days of standing water in 2/3 of our country, meaning that has caused serious health issue. Water started receding after 45 days. If there is long-standing water from the sea, from the river, and we need to have that kind of infrastructure. That's why we have put or set aside $200 million every year to build that kind of infrastructure. We are building cyclone shelters in the rural areas in the hundreds, not in thousands. That costs so much of needs so much of investment, and this is an area we need the international community to come forward to help us. There are other issues, and even the river erosion has increased. During monsoon time, we have excess water. During winter time, there is less water in the river. That causes serious river erosion, displacing people from the villages, and they land in the big cities and become refugees or kind of shanty dwellers in big cities in Bangladesh. In our capital city, we have 20 million people living. You understand the kind of seriousness of the climate impact. So there is no illusion that there is no climate impact. Seriously, we are facing it.
Yeah,
and we are trying to
the
deal with it. We have your support. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start from wherever, whoever wants to take whichever question or maybe just a comment.
Well, I'll just make a comment on the carbon tax, I think. It's worked extremely well also in the UK. And I've been quite disappointed that the European Commission has not decided to go down that route, and I'm not surprised that there's now a challenge of the fact that our targets are not as ambitious. On the issue, I entirely agree with the arguments. First of all, I entirely agree that food is another aspect. I think we were just using one example rather than saying that water is the only issue. And solidarity is needed. I'm not so convinced that more aid is what is needed. I think we actually in the West need to change the way we live. That's the most way that we can help. So we need to become completely, our energy consumption needs to change dramatically. And there is a need for the government to actually assist that. For example, in Spain, the country that has a lot of sun, the government is making sure that there is no incentive for ordinary people to put solar panels on their houses. so it's the opposite of what there should be. So there are many things that governments can do, but many things that we as ordinary people can do. For example, there should not be any plastic bottles here. So there are things that we can do. So I would say, yes, investment is needed, and that's one way of doing things. But I say that in order for there to be the right kind of investment, we actually need to change the way we finance investment, the way we actually draft contracts and everything else. So there's a radical change that is needed there, but ultimately it is changing the way we live.
Of course, we talked about water, and we have to understand that 70% of the use of water has to do with agriculture, has to do with food. So, you know, there is a very strong link here. But of course, it's also a tragic link in many ways. I was in Stockholm last week at the World Water Week discussions, and one hears, for example, in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, the crop yields today about 50% of global average because of salination, because of problems with agriculture. And the critique which one hears is that much of the irrigation is still at the same level of technology as was used at the time of Hammurabi. This comes from water experts. This is not politicians or diplomats like me, professors. This comes from water experts. So things have to change in techniques of irrigation as well. And there are good examples. In Jordan, of course, as a result of water shortages, they have found more efficient ways of irrigating and more efficient support for drought-resistant crops and so forth. So, I mean, there are many things that can be done to alleviate the problem of food shortages and better use of water in that context. So that's one thing that I want to say. The second thing, and the only other thing that I want to mention is, of course, the whole big question of assistance, official development aid, cooperation and all that. Clearly, and I agree with you, I mean, the main contribution of the developed world would be to change its own patterns. That would be the major change, major contribution. But then again, I think I would advise everybody to watch very carefully the evolution of discussions in the group of G20. They're going to have an interesting conference this year in Buenos Aires dealing with these questions. There is, of course, a more and more concentrated focus on development assistance on Africa. But again, it's very difficult. I mean, the past examples are not, it's not suggesting success. There are difficult questions like the population growth in some parts of Africa, which are not addressed very directly and with an effective policy mechanism. So let us not underestimate the difficulty here. But let us take the international cooperation and development assistance as a major instrument that has to be used.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I think that you said really the very good things to the point. So the problem is not so much with the solidarity, but what we do ourselves, because we should take the first steps. And I think that most of the solutions what we could in our own lives do are not very expensive. They would be rather less expensive than the way we used to live now, and then secondly more healthier, and then saving the environment. So we would have three kinds of benefits. Let's say environmental benefits, economic benefits, and then our own health benefits. And I just could make a list of, let's say, 4 or 5 steps, what would be not that difficult to take. We can change over the renewable energy sources. I don't know if each country has a system where also on the family level you can choose what kind of energy you use, but at least in Finland we can make an agreement with the energy producer, what type of energy we use, so that to make a contract on renewable energy. And now I mentioned that solar and wind are getting competitive, so it would not even cost you more, it would cost you less. And solar energy would be also very, let's say, easy solution to most of the developing countries, because then you would not need the networks, and also the, let's say, the mass production is becoming very cheap. There we need the solidarity to let's say, have economic cooperation, so that the developing countries would have an easy access to solar panels. Then I think that one major source of climate emissions are related to our food production, and we still seem to go even more towards using meat and then processed food. So it would be more climate friendly to eat more fish and domestic vegetables and berries, and that would be also most cases cheaper than the red meat, imported red meat, and then secondly also more healthier. Then related to this food is also the issue of waste. We should sort out our waste and reduce also the accumulation of waste. We can, for instance, in the shops make some kind of civil riots in that way, that we wrap out the unnecessary packages and leave it to the shop. I don't think that it would take too long, then the shop would notice that they have to also lessen the wrapping and unnecessary waste. But also almost half of the food which is produced is wasted, so that is a big issue we should cut. And then finally we should also start walking shorter distances and using bikes, because transport is one main source of emissions. All these would be such simple things which would not at all reduce your standard of living. It would not increase your personal or family budget, and they would be healthier.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, if my colleagues who are coming from aid-giving countries all believe that we shouldn't give more aid, who am I to disagree? But I know, I'm being facetious. But I want to just, all of the comments were very good. I wanted to call out Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is actually one of the few countries that is actually putting not only its own resources, but its own ideas, the right ideas. My country, for example, isn't doing that. And I think that is what's happening in Bangladesh on climate politically is very spectacular. I don't think it's really happened at that scale in any developing country. But I wanted to take the comment on food. I don't know if the lady is here, but you're exactly right. So we talked about water, but water is not the only one. And as the President rightly said, I mean, my way of saying it is, food is just nature's way of packaging water. So instead of putting it in bottles, nature just takes water and puts it in food so that it can move around. So food is very intrinsically, as you said, linked to water. The good news, to prove that I'm not entirely pessimistic, I did a study back in Pakistan, and what we found was that 30 years, because of climate change, GDP could go down by 6% because of climate change in 30 years. However, by taking adaptation measures, most of which were about water, GDP could go up by 2%, right? So the delta is actually 8%. So the good news is, just like we found with energy, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Just like we found bulbs were so inefficient that you could put new technology, we use water so inefficiently, particularly in food, that we could actually have a gain. Now, I should caution, food is not just about availability of food. Right? The greatest indicator of a famine is not drought, it is bad institutions. Right? That's what Amartya Sen told us. So all of that. What worries me actually much more, and I hope I'm wrong, is disease. What we are finding is that because of climate, the mosquito is much smarter than man. Maybe not woman, but certainly smarter than man. And we are seeing this with dengue, right? We are seeing this with the vertical rise of dengue. Dengue is coming to climates where it isn't supposed to be. And I think the big headline that this forum will be talking about is disease vectors finding their way to places they aren't supposed to. You're finding that in the Mediterranean, you're finding that in South Asia. But the last point, and this is where I think a lot of, I've talked about global and international, but a lot of things that have to be done domestically. Most importantly, countries like my own Pakistan have to start redefining what security means. 2006, all countries have to do that, but certainly countries, I don't know if there's an Indian here, this is not a political statement. 2006, I wrote a book on human security and climate. One of the things back of the envelope we found was, at that point, it was 60 years of constant conflict between India and Pakistan. Not 1, 2, 3, 60 years of constant conflict. This is not a political statement, I made it in both countries. In 60 years of conflict, listen to the numbers carefully, 60 years of conflict, total number of Indians killed by Pakistan side in 60 years is less than the number of children only who will die in 1 year only because of water only in New Delhi only. Exactly the same number is true on the Pakistan side in Karachi. Now, as a security person, as a policy person, here's my problem. If you are the mother of that child who just died, your child is no less dead whether she dies at the wrong end of a gun or the wrong end of a tap. And yet, we as so-called scholars, we as journalists, we as policymakers, we as politicians, apologies, talk about one death as if it's a national tragedy, and the other death as if it's just a development statistic. Here's my problem. 30 years of teaching security. I have no idea what to do about the gun. I have absolutely no idea what to do about the gun. I know exactly what to do about the tap. $8.36. $8.36 was the cost of saving one of those lives lost to water. Right? That, to me, is where security needs to go.
Yeah, very good. So I would not dare conclude with such a powerful message at the end. So thank you very much, participants, and thank you very much, Mr. President, Anna, Ms. Khalila, and Dr. Najam for joining us. Thank you, everybody, and bye.